Hello, everybody. I wanted to start off, first of all, by thanking you for being here and for doing your assignments that you're supposed to be doing. This is not a vacation, so I hope you're all still doing your work. So if you were not able to figure this out based off of the title of this assignment, we are starting to look at some folklore, and we're going to be working on learning about folklore and what that means and what is an example of folklore in the next little while. I wanted to start off by breaking down some of the misconceptions about folklore that exist. So if you answered the question on the slide that asks, what is folklore? What do you think that means? What do you think that is? A lot of you probably said something along the lines of folklore are really old stories or fake stories or myths or urban legends. Those are a lot of things that are often said when you think about folklore. Or things that are fake, made up, not real, etc. So some of those things may be what you said you think folklore is or what that really means. I'm going to tell you that those things aren't actually what folklore is. Namely, specifically, the biggest misconception about it is that folklore is stuff that's really old, that was told like in the 1900s or early on. That's not true. That's not what folklore is. In fact, folklore is constantly being updated. There's folklore that exists today that didn't exist yesterday. And you'll understand a little bit better what I mean by the end of this video. So let me start off with giving you a definition. Folklore are stories that are passed on from person to person by word of mouth. Okay. I'll give you some examples and that'll help you to understand. So you're probably really familiar with some of the newest forms of folklore. You probably just don't know that that's what it is. So some examples of folklore that some of you are probably really familiar with, whether or not you think it's funny or you participate in it, you're at least familiar with some of these examples. So first of all, I've heard many of you say this. I know all of you have heard it. If you have ever heard or said the words, "Okay, boomer," that's folklore. That is something that you heard by word of mouth. You heard other people say it, or you read it on a meme. You saw it. Then you maybe probably heard other people say it. Then maybe you even said it yourself. Caesar says it to me in class all the time. So if you're in my 4A class, you hear me be called a boomer all the time, right? That is an example of folklore. Or from a little bit earlier in the year, if you heard anybody say, "Who's Joe?" "Joe Mama," right? That is another example of folklore. That's something that you heard other people say. It was passed on from person to person by word of mouth. Another really example of folklore that all of you are familiar with, I know every single one of you is familiar with this form of folklore. Memes. Every time you show a friend a meme or you read a meme, you go onto Instagram and you look at the meme pages or wherever you're getting your memes out there. Memes are an example of folklore. The different formats of memes, you'll see one person use it, and if it's really funny, if it's a successful meme, if a lot of people like it and laugh at it and share it, then the format for that meme will become popular and you'll see it reused in different ways. For example, one of the ones from this year that was the most popular that I saw a lot of was the "Aight, I'm a head out" memes with the little SpongeBob getting off of his chair. That meme picked up a lot of speed because it was passed from person to person by word of mouth. Here's another example. I'll let you guys all laugh at me really quick. Some of you are probably filming videos or familiar with videos that look something like this. Right, I don't know how it works, but that's an example of folklore. You saw someone else do it and you repeated it. Here's another one. This is a little bit older, but if you've ever done this or seen someone do this, okay, that is an example of folklore. It's something that got really popular, you saw other people do it, and then maybe you started doing it, or maybe you didn't, but you've at least seen it done by multiple people, okay? So that's what folklore actually is. And again, it's being updated every single day. Right now, you've probably seen a huge surge of memes that are about the quarantine or about coronavirus or COVID-19 or whatever, something along the lines of that, the lockdown, what people are going to do when the lockdown is over, the day 14 of quarantine, whatever, those memes that are really popular right now. And the cool thing about this, guys, you may not realize this, but this is going to be part of history. So one day in the year 2020, or sorry, that's this year, in the year 2120, ninth graders out there are probably gonna study some of the memes that have come out this year that are about the quarantine, or last year about storming Area 51, or some of these things that are actually kind of like historical events. It's gonna be passed on for a long time, and these memes that are being made right now about the quarantine are probably gonna be studied one day in a class in high school way in the future. So you guys don't maybe realize this, but a lot of the stuff that you participate in every single day that's getting passed on person to person is gonna go down in history, which is pretty cool. And so I wanted to make sure, if you weren't fully understanding the definition of folklore, it's something that's passed on person to person by word of mouth. And it comes from the Latin roots folk, meaning people, and lore, meaning stories. Okay, so that's kind of how that breaks down and how you can remember that. People telling stories, and those stories spreading and gaining fame. And it doesn't actually necessarily have to be something that gets really famous. So some other forms of folklore that I want you to be familiar with and to know that these are things that are folklore that you probably participate in or are at least familiar with. We've talked in the past couple weeks, well, we haven't talked because we haven't been together in person, but we've read in the past couple weeks some different things about love and how love works inside your head and the chemical balance that creates love and etc. So there's a lot of folklore that also exists that surrounds love or love stories. It's not necessarily like your rom-com films. That's not folklore. That's a rom-com film. That's a different genre. But what is folklore is if you and your friends have ever told the story of your first kiss. Okay, so it's something that you pass on by word of mouth. Like if you have ever told the story of your first kiss, if you've ever told somebody about your first boyfriend or girlfriend or significant other, those are stories that are related to love that are passed on, right? You tell people about that. If it's a really, really funny story, maybe somebody else will repeat that story and it will get passed on. But maybe not. Maybe it will just stop at telling your friends. That's still being passed person to person by word of mouth. Another great, this is my favorite category of folklore, but another great example is scary stories. Okay, so that's what we read today, or we listened to and followed along with in the slideshow earlier with the distorted warning signals. That is an example of folklore. That is a scary story that somebody told and said, "This happened to me and it was terrifying. Listen to this cool story." Okay. Slender Man is another example of this, that the Slender Man story gets told person to person and it becomes an urban legend. Some of these stories are things that it could be something that really did happen to you. Maybe this is your story of your experience with the supernatural. So here's an example of a story that I personally have actually told to some kids in my 2A class. You'll be familiar, maybe you heard me telling this story, but I didn't tell it in any of my other classes, so I'll tell you now. So this actually happened to my mom, not to me. But one time my mom was laying in bed, it was late at night, and she was with my little sister. And my dad wasn't home. He normally sleeps in the same bed as my mom, right? But he wasn't home, so my mom had my little sister laying in the bed with her. My little sister was probably like three or maybe 4 at this time. And they were facing each other, okay? Looking at each other, and my mom was facing with her back to the door to the bedroom, and my sister was facing towards her, so her face was towards the door. So my mom's looking at the window, my sister's looking at the door to the room, and they're falling asleep. They're almost asleep. My mom's eyes are closed, she's getting sleepy, and my little sister taps on her and she says, "Mommy." And my mom opens her eyes and she goes, "What, hon?" And my sister points to behind my mom and she goes, "Who's that man standing behind you?" Okay, so it's just a creepy story. My mom told me that happened to her. I've told lots of other people about that story, so it gets passed on person to person by word of mouth. That's a story that was specific to me, that happened in my house to me, and that's how some scary story folklore pieces exist. But there's also some that are more famous, like the Slender Man stories. Everybody knows about Slender Man. That's a famous story. Maybe you've heard of the Old Hag. The Old Hag is another really famous story that's told. So the folklore goes that late at night, sometimes people will wake up and they'll see this old hag in their room, and they'll go to scream or they'll go to get up and they won't be able to. And the old hag will slowly walk towards them and she'll sit down on top of them, and the person won't be able to move, they won't be able to scream, they won't be able to do anything. There'll just be this old hag sitting on them, and then they'll wake up. So that story actually comes from sleep paralysis. I know Francisco's experienced sleep paralysis. I don't know if any of the rest of you have, but sometimes when people have sleep paralysis, they'll see something. And the old hag was one of the things that people infamously saw. So they would see this person, this old hag, come sit on them, and they'd tell their friends, and their friends would tell their friends, and it would spread, and people didn't realize that it came from sleep paralysis. I could keep talking about the scary stories. I'll stop because we want to get through a few others before this video gets too long, but that's another form of folklore. And the story that I actually had you read came from a website called Creepypasta. If you've never heard of that, it's a website on the internet that people can upload their own scary stories and share their stories with other people. So it's basically a website that is full of folklore. It is just all folklore because it's all stories that people upload to tell something that happened to them. Whether or not it's real doesn't matter. If you really experienced it or not, doesn't make it folklore or not. It's the fact that these people are telling this story in their own words and passing it on. Another form of folklore is inside jokes. You all have inside jokes with your friends or with your family members, people that are close to you, but inside jokes is another really great form of folklore because these are things that nobody ever writes down, nobody ever makes it official that this is a joke that we tell. It's just something that happened and you keep repeating it or saying it or referring to it because it's funny for your friends. An example of folklore, an example of an inside joke. Some of you know exactly what I mean when I tell you that Charlie's pencil is still sitting out there on the ground. Okay. Some of you in your heads, you just went, I know exactly what Miss Canuck is referring to. Some of you had no clue. That's an inside joke with my 2A class. So, and now you guys know Charlie's pencil is a piece of folklore now. It has become folklore because we have talked about it and passed it on and told other people. I'm going to tell you a slightly embarrassing story of an inside joke. Another form of inside joke is nicknames. If you have a nickname or you've given a nickname to your friends, or the story that I'm going to tell, we give a lot of nicknames to boys that we thought were cute when I was in college. So this is a really embarrassing story for me, but it's an example of folklore, so I'm going to tell it to you. So, in college, a lot of my friends and I would give nicknames to boys that we thought were cute. And we all knew the different nicknames. So I had a crush on this boy named Dimples, and my friend had a crush on a boy named Fire, and we just had different names for all the boys. And we would give them these nicknames so that we could talk about the boy in front of the boy, or if he was nearby, and we knew that we were safe and he wouldn't know that we were talking about him. And that was my freshman year of college that we did that, and we had all these different names. There were so many of them, and we all knew the different names. And when we got to my sophomore year, we had a new roommate who moved in, a really, really sweet girl, but she didn't know any of the nicknames because this all happened freshman year. So she would try to learn them, and she'd try to get them, and she knew some of them that we talked about more. Like, she knew Dimples, she had that one down. But some of the ones that were less popular, she would get a little confused, and she was like, wait, what was his name again? Oh yeah, Eyebrows, right? And she would kind of try to figure it out. But she wasn't part of the folklore when it first existed, so she was a little less familiar with it. So one time, we all went out to one of the on-campus cafes, and we were all getting food, and this boy, our friend, who I thought was cute, his name was Shomo. That was his real name. That wasn't a nickname. This boy Shomo comes walking in, and he comes and sits down at a table like right behind us, and Sydney gets so excited, and she goes, Stormy, isn't that the boy you think's really cute, Shomo? And I was like, why are you saying his name? And she said it so loud he could obviously definitely hear it. He like looked back and was like, what the heck? Why is she talking about me? What's going on? And she's like, yeah, Shomo, remember? And I was like, yeah, I remember. Shut up. Why are you saying his name so loud? And she goes, what? Isn't that his nickname? And I was like, no, Sydney, that's his real name. That's his name. And it was so mortifying and embarrassing. So inside, and that joke, I tell people that all the time. It was really embarrassing, but it's an example of folklore. First of all, the nicknames are an example of folklore. She didn't know about them. She didn't know Shomo was his real name. But also, the fact that I tell that story now and I retell it as an embarrassing thing that happened to me, that's another way that is folklore, because I tell the story, so it's passed on person to person by word of mouth. Another famous example of different types of folklore, traditions. If you participate in any traditions, this is something that nobody writes down. It's not a rule that you have to follow, but you do because it's passed on, right? So, for example, my family opens one Christmas present every year on Christmas Eve, and it's always pajamas. And we wear the pajamas to sleep and then wear them the next day, Christmas morning. One that you're probably less familiar with, but maybe one day you'll start to experience this. There's a lot of folklore that exists in the workplace. So, these are things that you wouldn't know about these words or these phrases that are used unless you work at the place. So, for example, I just started working at a gas station just as a part-time job because I'm bored. So I just barely started working at this gas station, and when I got hired on, I was trained, I learned all the different things, take the trash out at this time, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then later on, as I was working with not the manager and not the person who trained me, but I was working with other coworkers, they all had this trash can that they referred to as the Charlie trash. And they would say, "Have you taken the Charlie trash out?" And I had no clue what that was. And one day I said, "What's the Charlie trash?" And they said, "Oh, it's the trash can that's right next to the front door." And I was like, "Why do you call it the Charlie trash?" And they said, "Because our owner, Charlie, he gets mad if that trash is too full, if it's overflowing. And it's the only trash can he really cares about. So you need to make sure that you take that one out. So that trash gets changed more than any of the others." Okay, so customers don't know that that's called the Charlie trash, right? It doesn't say Charlie on the front. There's no reason that it would be called Charlie trash to other people. But to insiders, we all know that that is the Charlie trash, and we refer to it as the Charlie trash. And that can also be based off of location, right? Other chevrons don't have a Charlie trash. That is specific to that gas station in this location with these coworkers. They all refer to it as the Charlie trash. So I worked at a Walmart when I was just fresh out of high school, when I was 18. And I worked at this Walmart for 5 months, and every single day when you came into work, you would go up to the manager and you'd say, "I need a register." And they'd put you on a register, and that was the register you'd stay on for a couple hours checking people out. So when I moved to Logan for college, I transferred to a different Walmart that was up there in Logan. And when I transferred to the different Walmart, I went in the first day and I walked up to the manager, and the manager looks at me and she goes, "Do you need a home?" And I was like, "No, I have an apartment. What do you mean?" And she goes, "Oh, no, a home. Do you need a home? Like a register?" And I was like, "Yeah, I need a register." And she goes, "Okay, here at this store, we call it a home. So when you come in, you just you'd say, 'I'm looking for a home,' and we'll get you a home." And I was like, "Okay, that's weird." So that phrase is used at that Walmart specifically, but it doesn't necessarily transfer to other Walmarts. So, and then one other one, this is a really fun example to talk about, and I've talked to some of the students in one of my classes about this, but childhood ones are really fun to talk about. Childhood pieces of folklore. This is a really, really great example. So if you've ever done the hand games, talking to you girls out there, maybe some of the boys too, but mostly the girls have probably done this when you were in elementary school during recess. A lot of people would play the lemonade game, right? It was lemonade, crunchy ice, beat it once, beat it twice. Okay, that's an example of folklore. That's something that you were taught by other kids, or maybe you just saw other kids playing it and you jumped in and played it. Or maybe one of your friends taught it to you, and so you taught it to another friend. Maybe you taught it to a younger sibling, whatever. It's passed on, and that game keeps getting passed on generation after generation. The kids today are still playing it. Kids before me played it. It's a game that's played. Or a really fun example, if you've ever played the game Down by the Banks. So it's the one where you have your hands like this, and and you go, "Down by the banks of the hanky-panky, where the bullfrogs jump from bank to bank, saying E-E-I-I-O-O-Ooh-Ooh, boom, slap-a-dilly, and a ballroom." Some of you probably just got really irritated because I sang a different version of the song than what you grew up with, right? So I'm going to give you an example of how this is different for different people. So that's the version I grew up with, and that's the only version I ever sang as a kid. But now, 10 years later, or more, kids are learning a different version of the song. So if you ask my little sister, and me and her argue about this all of the time, but if you ask my little sister to sing the song, she will do a different version, and she's gonna show you right now.
but I'm chewing. Down by the banks of the bankety bank, where the bullfrog jumped from the bank to bank, saying eep, ipe, ope, down, booms of a dilly in a ballroom on you. Did I do it right?
That's your version of it, then you did it right. Okay, that's the wrong version, right? But if you were raised at a different time or a different location, or you were taught by a different person, you might have a different version of that song, which is just another part of folklore. Different places are going to have different versions of the same thing. So I'll admit that it doesn't mean she's wrong, but don't tell her I admitted that. It doesn't mean she's wrong. It just means she was taught in a different way. So there's different versions of the folklore based off of where you live. So I now want to hear about some of the folklore that you're familiar with. Do you have a love story that you tell all of the time? Do you have a scary story that you've heard or that you've told, something that really happened to you or that happened to somebody else? Do you have an inside joke with friends? Do you have traditions that you do all the time? Maybe some of you do work and you do have experiences in the workplace with a word or a phrase that you wouldn't understand if you didn't work there. Maybe some of you have some childhood ones that you remember. What version of Down by the Banks do you know? Do you know a different version than one of the ones me or my sister just sang? So I want to hear a little bit about your folklore. I'm interested to see what you are familiar with and what you know and what you understand. Folklore is one of my favorite things. I'm really sad that we aren't able to talk about this in person because it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Folklore is so fun and so interesting. So remember, the meaning of folklore is that it is passed on person to person by word of mouth. And it's different from other literature because of that, because it's not necessarily something that's written down in textbooks and published. It's something that people just talk about, and you pass it on because people talk about it, because people care about it. They think it's cool, they think it's fun, they think it's exciting, so they talk about it and they tell this story over and over and over again, and it's passed on. And if you noticed, one of the biggest differences between that story that you listened to a couple slides ago, the distorted warning signals, that was really different from, say, To Kill a Mockingbird or And Then There Were None, because it was very conversational. The way it was written, the way it was told, that story was like you were just talking to one of your friends. That's one of the things about folklore. This is just... you're telling a story that you're familiar with, and so it's not as clean necessarily. It's more conversational. It's as if you're just talking to your buddy at your house while you're playing video games. So folklore is really cool. We're going to be focusing on it for a little while. Thank you for hanging in there and watching the video all the way through. We don't get to lecture anymore, but I still need to be able to teach you sometimes. So bear with me, watch this video from start to finish, and answer the questions on the next slide. Thanks, guys. I miss you all.